So first of all, let's talk about China's position on the crisis. Now, I would like to share with you 5 points which were made by the State Councillor and Foreign Minister of China, Mr. Wang Yi, on 26 February, after the crisis erupted. Number one, and I'm sure that you are broadly aware, but I thought that it's important to contextualize the talk and give you a background of what China's thinking is. Number one, China supports the territorial integrity and sovereignty of all its states, including Ukraine, and the principles of the UN Charter. Number two, China believes that the legitimate security concerns of all countries should be respected. Number three, China does not wish to see the current situation in Ukraine to continue and calls for restraint by all parties and the dialogue to resolve the issue. Number four, China supports a diplomatic solution and peaceful settlement of the crisis, but acknowledges, and this is important, that the Ukraine issue has a complex historical context. Number five, China does not support the use of force or sanctions, unilateral sanctions. China opposes American and EU sanctions while avoiding to refer to Russian attack as an invasion. China contends that the unilateral sanctions have no basis in international law and that they create more problems and impede the political settlement of conflicts, apart from worsening people's livelihoods. In its conversation with President Biden on 18th March, President Xi Jinping told him that indiscriminate sanctions would not only make people suffer, but in the long run will trigger serious crisis in global economy and trade, finance, energy, food and industrial supply chains, crippling the already fragile world economy affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokespersons have been critical of the US for stoking up war hysteria and what they call pouring oil on the flames. China has regarded the, 8 waves of NATO expansion eastward as, quote, undermining Russia's security. On 26 February, in the UN Security Council resolution, China abstained from condemning Russia, but it did not exercise its veto. China's opposition to NATO's eastward expansion is also explained by its wariness over the American ingress in the Indo-Pacific region under Quad and AUKUS security alliances. And this has been referred to by the earlier speakers also. For China, Russia is not only a strategic partner, and these ties have been reinforced after President Putin's visit to Beijing for the Winter Olympics, whereby, and this was a very important communique which was issued after the visit, whereby the two sides affirmed that there were no areas which were beyond limits as far as their cooperation was concerned. So this is very important. I think it was a 6,000 words joint statement which was issued, and there was a lot of commentary, especially in the West, on the implications of this statement. Now we should also remember that Russia is a member of the BRICS and SCO, and China is hosting the BRICS summit later this year, and Wang Yi's recent visit to India, among other issues, among other matters, was also in that context, because China wants to host this summit successfully. And it is also significant that other BRICS members, such as South Africa, India, and Brazil, have also not joined in applying any sanctions against Russia. Now, what are China's interests in the region? Of course, China has a difficult balancing act to perform in the current crisis, as it has not only close relations with Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, but also with the European Union, which is an important trading and investment partner. I think EU was the first largest, trading partner, but I think now it has been overtaken by ASEAN, if I'm not wrong. But it is still one of the most important trading partners of China. Russia-China trade was about 146 billion last year. This is important. More than half of which was energy. China and Russia are engaged in massive pipeline projects through Siberia. And it's, I think, a 30-year deal. 16% of China's crude oil imports and 9% of its gas imports come from Russia. China imports more than 10 million barrels of oil per day. So if the price of oil surges, of course, this will affect the Chinese economy, and its projected GDP growth rate of 5.5 this year will be affected. China also imports wheat and grains, sunflower oil from Russia and Ukraine, and the supply of these commodities may also be affected due to the ongoing conflict. On the strategic plane, in recent years, as I said before, China and Russia have forged a strong security partnership to cope with the challenge posed by the US containment strategy. And this containment strategy is not only aimed at China. Russia is also a revisionist power as far as the United States is concerned. President Xi Jinping and President Putin have, I think, met about 40 times or maybe more in recent years. And President Xi Jinping describes President Putin as a very dear or as a very close friend. So these kind of utterances on the part of Chinese leaders are rare. Both have demonstrated their convergence and unity against the American pressures. Both countries hold robust military exercises, cooperate in intelligence sharing and in countering terrorism, and Russia supplies military equipment to China as well. Basically, they have come together to weaken and dilute the US influence in various potential war zones and conflict-prone theaters. China would certainly not like to weaken its partnership with Russia. This is important, despite this conflict, due to menacing US strategy to contain her. Secondly, Russia is also extremely important for China due to its BRI project, and I think Professor Zhang mentioned, because connectivity routes of BRI pass through Central Asia and to Europe through Central Asia. And and of course there is this Trans-Siberian railway and other connectivity projects. And Central Asian importance for Russia is well known to all of us. So any strain or any tiff in relations with Russia can impede China's growing economic and financial footprint in these regions. Therefore, China and Russia are trying to find a commonality of interest in BRI and the Russian-sponsored Eurasian Economic Union. They are in discussion. When this initiative was launched by Russia, there were some reservations in China on the Russian project, But now I think they are trying to find a common ground. Now, there's a big question which has been raised, especially by Western analysts, whether China was caught by surprise with Russian invasion, as the impression is that President Putin took advantage of his visit to Beijing during the Winter Olympics. Now, this is, of course, I leave it to your imagination whether China was informed by President Putin before the invasion. Now, what are the limits of China-Russia nexus? China's stance has, of course, unnerved the Europeans, who are under huge pressure from the United States to downgrade their ties with Russia. And the Singapore diplomat, his name is Bilahari Kausikan, he remarked, and I quote, and this is important, so I thought I'll share it with you. The quote is that China does not have any other partner of the same strategic weight as Russia, who shares its distrust of the current international order, unquote. China would also not like to take any steps which would undermine the power base of President Putin. This is important. In multilateral forums, Russia and China often act in sync on issues like Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, Iran. Last week, China's judge on the International Court of Justice joined a Russian judge in dissenting from a ruling calling on Russia to halt its military offensive in Ukraine. China has also opposed Ukraine's bid in G20 ministerial meeting for a discussion on the current conflict in Ukraine. In the near term, China will be affected by the conflict in energy supplies, transportation costs, rise in commodity prices, and disruption in grain supplies. US and European sanctions could also result in secondary sanctions on Chinese enterprises, resulting in pressure on China-Russian trade. Russia could ban the export of some commodities like wheat and corn due to wartime factors. Russia recently announced a temporary ban on export of grains to EU, Eurasian Economic Union members like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Belarus, and Armenia. But I think Russia will try to maintain a steady trade with China, notwithstanding these pressures and these obstacles, using Chinese currency for clearing and settlement through what is called the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, or CIPS, of China, which is in some way an alternative to SWIFT. Currently, 23 Russian banks are reported to be connected to CIPS. And China has indicated that it would like a greater percentage of bilateral trade, including in oil and gas contracts, to be settled in Chinese currency, yuan. But this is one possibility. At the same time, experts have pointed out that the CIPS still relies on the SWIFT system for messaging, and is thus not a perfect arrangement. But I think they will find some way out. This is my feeling. Furthermore, targeted commercial sanctions will make trading with Russia increasingly difficult for China. The sanctions regime employed by the USA and its Western partners, I was reading somewhere, are in the range of over 5,000 sanctions applied on individuals and entities, and are very stringent, aimed at strangulating Russia. Now, can China play a more assertive role in the conflict? The crux of the crisis is strategic rivalry between the United States and Russia. And NATO has followed a very aggressive approach on the issue of expansion, with 8 rounds, and the last one was in 2020 when North Macedonia joined NATO. The Russian view of security inherited from the concept of balance of power since the early 19th century seeks to preserve this security space between Russia and NATO. If Ukraine joins NATO, Russia could lose its military base in Sevastopol, Crimea, and thus lose its influence over most of the Black Sea. Russia considers Ukraine historically inseparable. And I will quote here what Putin said on 23rd February. And the quote is that Ukraine, in the sense of a modern state, did not exist in the first place. Unquote. So Putin's adventure should be seen in the context of his interpretation of history. The war in Ukraine has led to resurrection of the US influence over its European allies, manifest in remarkable unity against Russia. It would help the United States to squeeze Russia as a major Eurasian power, and confrontation between Russia and Europe serves to strengthen US influence, constrain China's influence in Europe, advance the interest of American military-industrial complex, and emerge as an alternate source of energy supplies for Europe, which relies more than 40% of its gas supply from Russia. In the capital markets, the Russian-Ukraine conflict has strengthened the position of the dollar. The EU is Russia's largest trading partner. This is also important. China is the largest trading partner. Here, the EU is Russia's largest trading partner. Bilateral trade was about 282 billion last year. So bilateral trade will shrink, obviously, as the European countries join the sanctions. I agree with this assessment that this war is perhaps a great miscalculation, as Russia finds itself in a bind now. An economic meltdown of Russia could lead to even a regime change. Pragmatically speaking, it should be in the interest, I'm not rendering an advice, but I'm giving my opinion. It should be in the interest of Russia to conclude this conflict as soon as possible and work on a negotiated settlement with NATO. China is, of course, under pressure. US National Security Advisor Jack Sullivan told Mr. Yang Jiechi, who is higher than the State Counselor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi in Chinese hierarchy, in Rome on 14th March, that if China continues to support Russia, the US will consider imposing secondary sanctions on Chinese companies, which may face these companies to reconsider their trade arrangements with Russia. China's trade relations with the EU are more important than its business ties with Russia. However, Russia is a strategic partner and a reliable source of energy. China would therefore have to walk a tightrope and balance both sides. China is deeply embedded in global financial and economic architecture, and it does not wish to rock the boat. Chinese enterprises have interests across Europe and elsewhere globally. This strong interdependence and a mutual desire for a stable and predictable world order have benefited both China and the Europeans. European countries also do not wish to abandon their relationship with China. They do not want to choose sides between US and China. And another important thing is that on 1st April, 2 days from now, there will be this EU-China summit taking place, which will, of course, discuss the Ukraine crisis. And I think it may lay new ground rules for their future cooperation in the backdrop of this conflict. Europe's shift to China and Asia is an inevitable choice for the EU to sustain its economic development. This cannot be decoupled. Now, China as a mediator, I think China would not be a mediator on its own, as it does not wish to ruffle feathers with Russia, because if it, on its own, if it engages in this process or in this activity, it will face a lot of pressure from the West. And it will be difficult, I think, for China to hold on to or to resist that pressure in its entirety. So I think China is careful, China is cautious. It's possible that this EU-Russia summit, already negotiations are going on, Turkey is mediating. So it's possible that this canvas may be enlarged, and some European countries like Germany and France is also very active, and China, Turkey, they may combine. I can't say, but this is a possibility. Although there is pressure on China, Professor Zhang also mentioned that there are voices even within China that China should play a more proactive role in sort of, but I think it's difficult. Now, internally also, I think China will have to speed up or accelerate the process of economic reforms and to ward off the pressure from Europe, because there are certain issues between EU and China on intellectual property rights and investment related regulatory policies in China. So I think China may speed up this process through deregulation of its state systems to allow a more conducive environment for foreign investment. Another possibility, I don't know, maybe Russia and China will work together. I alluded to this one in the beginning, this currency swap and this arrangement. India is also, thinking of using, or maybe they have already decided to use Indian rupee for trade with Russia. So if this this possibility crystallizes, that China and Russia may work together along with India to form a bloc of like-minded countries who agree on a non-dollar denominated financial and trading system. Do I have 2 or 3 minutes?
Please, please.
The conclusion is that Ukraine has been part of Russia for centuries. And in fact, historically, during the Tsarist Empire, Russians considered Ukrainians and Belarusians as ethnically Russian. So this is the context. Why Russia is acting like that? And referred to them as Little Russians. Ukraine was independent from 1980. It has been under Poland, Romania, this and that for centuries. It has been part of Russian Empire gradually from 17th to 18th century, and then became part of Tsarist Empire. 1918, after the Russian Revolution, it declared its independence. That was short-lived. In 1922, it joins under a treaty with the USSR to become a founding member of the Union of Socialist Republics. And then you remember that in 2014, Khrushchev gifted Crimea, 1954, gifted Crimea to, because he was from Crimea, so he gifted Crimea to Ukraine, which was annexed by Russia in 2014. And so there have been contentious issues between Ukraine and there was a policy of Russification, which also created resentment. But amongst the current issues, of course, the oil and gas pipelines from Russia to Western Europe passing through Ukraine. And there have been issues of royalties and liabilities. Ukraine has gas debt arrears owed to Russia up to 75% of its gas and 80% of its oil was coming from Russia. In recent years, there have been tensions between them. In 2004, a Russian aircraft was shot down by Ukraine. Then during the Russian-Georgian war in 2008, President Putin alleged that Ukraine was supplying arms to Georgia. So there have been tensions. Then, I think 4 or 5 years ago, perhaps I don't remember the year, Ukraine hosted a very big air exercise, NATO exercise on its soil. And then, of course, its interest in joining NATO and, and EU. and the leaders which have been coming into power, pro-West and pro-Russian leaders in Ukraine, which have also created these divisions. This President Zelensky, who assumed power in 2019, has sort of polarized the situation further. US supports him. I don't know now what the figures are, but before the conflict still would be valid. US was the fourth largest supplier of military equipment, funding to Ukraine. So implications, of course, deterioration of US-Russia, Russia-NATO relations, pressure on China, future cooperation between Russia and US on areas like arms control, nuclear non-proliferation, cyber security, energy security, terrorism, and hot spots like Syria, Libya, Iran, Afghanistan could be affected. Global economy, European economy, Chinese economy will also be adversely affected. South Asia, I think Professor who preceded me raised very important points, how South Asia will sort of shape up its policy. I think for us in Pakistan, it is important to keep in mind how things evolve, how things shape up, what Indian policy will be. I think I describe Indian policy not as a non-aligned policy, but as an opportunistic policy. And Pakistan has excellent relations with China. Pakistan has growing relations with Russia. So we'll have to sort of modulate our policy accordingly. Professor Chang, this is my last point. He raised an important point. He said that Ukraine can be, if I understood him correctly, that Ukraine can be the next Afghanistan for Russia. I don't know, but this point should be analyzed or studied in the context of an information which I heard 3 or 4 days ago at a similar seminar in Islamabad, whereby, and this has not surfaced somehow in media, maybe researchers here would have come across, that Afghanistan is right now being flooded with SAMs, surface-to-air missiles, and other related, technology and equipment of a lethal nature. So if this information is correct and it came from a very authentic sort of person or a source, and if you put 2 and 2 together with the point which Professor Zhang has just mentioned, that Ukraine can be the next Afghanistan for Russia, with mercenaries going there, with militias being raised, I don't know. So there can be a lot of trouble for us in the region in future, especially if Afghanistan remains unstable, because there can be a cross flow of militants and terrorists and terrorist organizations which are already sheltered in Afghanistan. Thank you very much.